Excellent. All right, you are being recorded. So thank you all. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning, at least in Glasgow, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. We are thrilled to have an in-person audience today, as well as many of you joining online. And it is a pleasure on behalf of myself and my co-hosts and my co-chairs to welcome you. I'm Dr. Alexandra Harrington. I am your anchor in person. We are joined online by four wonderful speakers who will be providing you with some insights as well as advanced understandings in issues surrounding climate migration, not only from the perspective of law, but also from the perspective of the various areas that are influenced by legal policy or the lack of legal policy relating to climate migration and climate refugees, as they are somewhat colloquially referred to at various times. So if we could start our PowerPoint presentation, please. Thank you. And let's see, we had several iterations going at various times. So I will introduce our panel first and our online panel first, and then we will get into some background discussions. Joining us online today, as I mentioned, we have a number of key advocates and key stakeholder representatives. So joining us from Yale University, we have Dr. Maya Prabhu. Dr. Prabhu is both a medical doctor and holder of a JD. She is joining us in her capacity as Associate Professor for Law and Psychiatry at Yale University. We have as well Dr. Kate Burrows, who is a postdoctorate fellow at Brown University in the United States. We have Professor Anna Dyson joining us from Yale as well, from the School of Architecture, where she is a professor. And we have joining us from the IFRC Disaster Law Section, Advocate Tommaso Natoli, who will be our final speaker, last and in absolutely no way least. And I, as I mentioned, I'm Professor Dr. Alexandra Harrington. I am the Research Director at the CISDL, as well as the Executive Director of the Center for Global Governance and Emerging Law. Can we start the slides, please? One second. Now, to provide some framing of the issue of climate migration and what are often some of the really core legal misconceptions and nomenclature misconceptions that have caused a great deal of confusion for lawyers and non-lawyers alike, and that continue to plague us, it is important to understand the terminology around refugees and migrants and where the gaps exist for the climate issues involved. So what we see and what we understand is that our view, our legal view, and much of our societal view of refugees comes from the immediate post-World War II period. So the conventions that we have, the legally binding international instruments on migration, on refugees, come from the post-war period when the initial focus was to assist those who had migrated as a result of conflict, so through no fault of their own, as a result of conflict, either in staying in the places where they were found, where they went and then sought refuge and were found after the war, or in returning home. And by the 1960s, this became the backbone of a larger understanding of the idea of refugees as not only those who were displaced by war, but also those who were displaced by subsequent conflicts, not just World War II, as well as subsequent driving political factors and often societal or socioeconomic factors that made it very difficult for people to stay where they were originally from. At the time, perhaps obviously, climate was not something that was discussed. And the original concepts of refugees remained mute on this particular subject, and they continue to do so today. So as you see charted on the PowerPoint slide, both the initial 1951 convention and then the subsequent protocol in 1967 created what we understand and what we still use as refugee law at the international level. Now, obviously, national level can be different. National level can change and use a variant if that is desired. However, to date, most countries have stepped away from the climate migration issue in terms of refugees. Next slide, please. Thank you. And indeed, what we see from 1967 is an understanding of the need to be flexible. The need to be flexible, the need to understand that refugee pushes, refugee drivers emerge over time, they change over time. And in our post-World War II society, which has a much more human rights-based approach to how we view international law, this has become more than just a manner of addressing war and conflict. But what we don't have in here is a discussion of anything having to do with environment at all. Next slide, please. What we also need to remember when we speak of anything having to do with climate migration is the concept of statelessness. And for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, statelessness is very much as it sounds and as it suggests. So the idea of an individual or a group of individuals being rendered stateless, being rendered without nationality, without citizenship, through no fault of their own, or sometimes through attributable actions of their own that will then void their citizenship status. We do have two conventions that relate to this, or a convention and then a subsequent convention, one from 1954 and one from 1961, describing statelessness and defining what the idea of a stateless person is, namely a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Why do we mention this here? We mention this here because if there are predictions that do come true in terms of especially the small island states in the South Pacific, such as the Maldives, where we expect that those islands may be rendered uninhabitable at some point in the near future due to climate change, there will be, and indeed there currently is, an intense debate in international law as to whether or not the inability to inhabit the physical space upon which you have based your state will then void your ability to claim that you are a state. Would it then, for example, void the Maldives' identity as a state? And were that to be the case, you would then have a great deal of people who would potentially be rendered stateless, who would not qualify as refugees, who under some versions of the idea of migration would qualify as a migrant, but might not, and who would be rendered stateless and thus subject to at least these types of protections. But these types of protections do not anticipate an environmental cause. They anticipate a very much political cause. And sometimes they anticipate the idea that someone who speaks out would then wind up being a political person who would be rendered stateless as a result. Next slide, please. Set against the idea of binding international law, we also have some soft law principles on environmental migration. And for those of you who are familiar with the International Organization for Migration, this has been the strongest driver in what we do know about at least the construct of an environmental migrant, so one who moves for environmentally derived purposes. And there is a very convenient definition. I will not take the time to read it. I would not like to take that much time away from my co-presenters, but there is an understanding of environmental drivers as emerging and as likely to continue to emerge, having to do with climate change, and also having to do with things like displacement, border management, labor issues, as well as the possibility of return should, for example, something having to do with a hurricane or a cyclone lessen its impact over time. And overall, the soft law right now stress is on the intersections between law, governance, migration, and environmental stressors. But we don't have hard law existing at the moment to address this. Next slide, please. And in the concept of COP and the way that we are discussing it today, it is important to remember that climate migration really has only come into the discussion in the Paris Agreement moving forward. UNFCCC system essentially started a discussion in 2010 with the idea of a task force on displacement, but it was only after the Paris Agreement itself that we really started to see this discussed in the larger COP context. And it certainly will be discussed this year. It already has been discussed this year. But at present, we have no legally binding COP-based decisions. We have no legally binding forms of conventions or other treaties that would give us any type of understanding that can be relied on as to what a climate migrant is, or more accurately, what a climate refugee is or would look like in the future. Next slide, please. And so with that as a bit of a background and framing, we move on next to our following slide. And this order seems to be a bit different than what I had in my notes, but
actually, are we able to move ahead to Kate's slides, actually?
That's what they were meant to be, yeah. So if you could start with Kate Burrow's slides, please. They look to be, if you scroll up. This is the joy of the COVID and hybrid world. So we thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. So I think that if you start at try 9 or 10, it looks like it should be. No. When did you receive them? Okay. These are different slides. I think these are for one of the other.
No, these are slides for Anna Dyson, who will be our fourth speaker. Kate Burrows, can happily very quickly resend.
I see at least one of them as number 10. And you might try number 9. Nope, that's no 10. 11. No, I don't know what happened with these, but I will
resend them if Kate wants to begin.
Yes, Kate.
Sure, that's fine. I'm happy to start without slides, and then if you want to send them over, we can go from there. But so thank you, Alex, for the introduction. I am an environmental epidemiologist by training, which means that I'm interested in understanding how health is impacted by environmental factors. And so a lot of my work is focused on understanding how the environment may lead to population mobility, and then how that may impact health and well-being. So I'd like to start off with a sort of overview of how the environment influences mobility, which hopefully can serve us throughout this panel. And if we could get those slides, that would be helpful, just because there is a visual component to this. But the first thing that I want to highlight is that when we think about the environment and the way it influences mobility at a basic conceptual level, this is a very complicated pathway with many different inputs at many different scales. And so I think originally when we first started talking about these concepts, it was framed a bit more as the environment directly influencing mobility and having that be sort of a singular pathway. But in fact, what we can see is that factors that influence mobility decisions can be grouped into 3 different rough levels. The first is macro level factors. And these are things like environmental, political, or economic factors. The second is meso-level factors, so things like social networks. And these are the facilitating or hindering factors that can influence migration. So I think social networks, for example, are a good example here as something that could make it a bit easier for a person to relocate. And then the last is micro-level factors. And these are our individual level factors like age or sex that could influence a person's decision to move or stay in place. And ultimately, all of these factors collectively influence a person's decision to relocate. So what I'd like to highlight about this is that the environment acts as one of many macro level factors. And in fact, climate change influences all of these macro level factors together. And this is important because it demonstrates that in our current understanding of climate mobility, we're really pushing for incorporating the environment into existing understandings of the already various factors that can influence migration. So if you want to make that full screen, this does a good job of showing this these multiple pathways. And so this image was produced by Black et al. Nearly a decade ago, and I think does a really great job at setting up this framing. And what I want to highlight from this image that I think is a really foundational question is how do we actually identify or define climate migrants? So it can be extremely difficult, as Alex mentioned, to isolate the environment as the single driver, or as the IOM puts it in that definition, really a significant driver that results in a person's ability to relocate or decision to relocate. And this, of course, has implications for legal decisions. So the other side to this that I want to highlight is that just because a person is exposed to climate change, so we can see the influence of environmental drivers on the left in black. Macro level factors are this sort of five-sided shape. Meso factors are on the bottom right there, and then micro level factors are on the top. And so the other side to this question is that just because a person is exposed to climate change in some way does not mean that they will definitely relocate. And that may seem somewhat obvious, but I think it's important because some of the early estimates of the number of climate migrants were mostly focused on identifying people who were living in areas that were potentially exposed. So for example, with sea level rise, we would map out areas that we thought would be exposed to sea level rise and assume that populations living in this area would become climate migrants. But when you include all these other pathways and really view the environment as one of many different macro level factors, it can be clear that it's more difficult to predict whether or not a person will move. And if they do move, whether or not we actually view them as an environmental migrant or a political or economic migrant, for example. And so the last thing that I want to highlight here is that this image frames mobility as a decision. So you can see that in big print on the right, decision, migrate or stay. And this really suggests that people are choosing to relocate or to stay in place. And this is an important challenge in our framing or understanding of climate migration. And it's something that I'll talk about more in the next couple of slides. So if you could advance the slide deck, that would be great. Thank you. So when we think about different types of mobility that may be associated with climate change, I think it's important to consider two different spectra. So on the x-axis, we have involuntary to voluntary moves. And on the y-axis, we have temporary to permanent moves. And in general, though not always, because these words are not used consistently, moves that are involuntary or forced are usually referred to as displacements, and moves that are more voluntary are considered to be migration. So displacements are shown here on the left in gray, and migrations are shown here on the right in blue. And as it relates to climate change, because these words are obviously used when talking about migration more broadly than environmental migration, but when we use these words when talking about climate change, we tend to think about sudden onset events as causing displacement. So these are things like wildfires and landslides and hurricanes, and slower onset events we usually think about as resulting in migration. And this really has to do with the fact that the link between the environmental exposure and relocation is often more direct when we're talking about a sudden onset disaster. It's more proximate in these cases. So if you think about the image that I showed on the last slide, you can kind of cut out a little bit more of that middle ground and think more directly about a link between the environment and the relocation decision. So, for example, if a person's home is damaged or destroyed because of a landslide or a fire, they may literally have no choice but to relocate, at least temporarily. So we may view this as a forced relocation, but in contrast, somebody who moves out of an area that's going to be affected by sea level rise, for example, may have some degree of choice because that event is happening more slowly. But the problem with this division is that we could obviously argue that migration associated with sea level rise isn't truly voluntary, even if it is happening in anticipation of an adverse event or disaster. So I think there are two important points that actually come out of this kind of lack of clarity. The first is that most climate related moves really fall somewhere on this spectrum, and that's why I've set it up as an axis here. And in fact, it may be really difficult or even misleading to really assign these binary categorizations of forced or not forced moves. And the second thing that I think I want to highlight is that temporality is particularly important when we think about climate-related mobility. So does a person have time to plan to relocate, to prepare to move, to find somewhere else to go? And especially this is important as we think about health outcomes. But in fact, I view this as potentially a more productive way to categorize moves, ones that are made in anticipation of disasters and ones that are made in response or ad hoc in response to disasters. So another challenge or consideration that I want to mention is recognizing that climate-related mobility can range greatly in terms of time frame. So some of these moves are temporary, so things like short-term evacuations or cyclical or seasonal migration, which is commonly used as an adaptive strategy in many parts of the world. And others of these are more permanent. And so ultimately incorporating all of these various concepts into single terms like climate refugee potentially, or even climate migrant can be quite challenging. And ultimately, I think it ends up having to be a little bit reductive in order to be able to use a single term to talk about this wide range of different moves and also different movers, different individuals. So this creates another challenge in the question of how we define or talk about climate migrants, and that is who gets included. Is it only the permanent movers? And how forced is forced enough to merit legal protections? If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So in this last minute or so, I want to end by highlighting what I view as a really important and emerging challenge in this work, and that is the question of immobility. So I really think that if we're going to be talking about climate migrants, it's also essential to consider who isn't moving and why they aren't moving. So traditionally, migration as it relates to climate change and the environment was really viewed as a last resort, where people wanted to stay in place and they would only move if they really had to. But it has been increasingly documented, including in some of my own empirical research, that migration can be a successful adaptive strategy following exposures to disasters. So migration can take people out of harm's way, it can prevent exposure to repeated disasters, and in some cases, it can also provide new opportunities for education or employment. And in many cases, and this is what's important about this concept, is that it's the lower income or already disadvantaged populations who may not be able to relocate because of the high costs associated with moving or because of other social or health-related factors that are keeping them in place. And so this can lead to what we call a trapped population. And that is a group of individuals who are effectively stuck in an area that may experience frequent or repeated climate events in the future, which then can, as this image shows, create a bit of a feedback loop, which further exacerbates pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. So I bring up this image at the end here, not to suggest that migration is always or even often the solution here, but to acknowledge that in some cases it can be beneficial. And so while we're having these conversations about protections for those who do relocate because of climate-related events, I think it's important that we also consider the needs of those who stay in place, and specifically those who stay in place but may wish to be able to be relocated but not be able to do so. So I think I'll end there for the sake of time, but thank you for listening. I'm excited to take some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was absolutely brilliant and insightful, and with and without slides, very helpful. Thank you. And I think we will now move to Maya.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I've just been advised by our technical support, who's been very patient with us, that, and I send this as a message to Anna and Tommaso as well, that we will end up screen sharing. So you can arrange to pull up your own screen slides as well. So let me just screen share and I will discuss briefly climate migration, thinking a little bit from the empirical data, talking a little bit around health, and some lessons for international law. So I'm going to pick up what Kate was just speaking about the challenges of relating the empirical research to translating into a legal definition or legal policy. Just a comment, hopefully we'll be able to join you at the next COP, and we'll be able to describe the outcomes of a study that we have been doing, in which we're trying to map legal definitions of climate migration onto empirical and field research. This work research is still in progress, but some of our important takeaways is that while we are accustomed to trying to identify consistent, unified international definitions, in this particular context, where we're finding are likely to be significant differences by regions and by climate exposures. And that points the way, I think, to ultimately what might be regional, local frameworks and definitions and legal and regional and local legal solutions. So more on that, I think, at COP27. But the second point that I wanted to make would be the one that our speaker who wasn't able to join us today as planned, Sunil Amrith, who is also at Yale, wanted to make the point that the majority of climate migrants will be internal, that they'll be going to move along existing social networks, and border contexts and political border and border policies are going to also contribute to people staying local rather than moving across, for the most part, international borders. 2018 World Bank study, the model, the groundswell model, forecasts that climate change, depending on which climate scenario we're looking at, may result in 3% of the global population moving within their country of origins by 2050. The point I wanted to make here is that because most climate migration as far as we can anticipate it with current models, will be happening internally. Most of that migration will be contributing to growing urbanization and peri-urbanization. We're all familiar with the concept. There is almost no continent or country that is free from the growth of sometimes what is known as informal settlements, but perhaps the kinder way to think about it is that these are all human settlements. So individuals migrating slowly to concentrically circles around large cities, which has implications both for health and social services and for thinking about infrastructure. And my next colleague, Anna, is going to speak about the infrastructure needs. What I wanted to say is that just as Kate sort of emphasized, it is very difficult to disengage the climate stressor from thinking about the many layers of stress that climate migrants may experience. Building on my own research and work and experience with treating convention refugees, individuals who have been displaced, individuals who choose to move, will experience many different layers of trauma and stress. First relates to the actual exposure event itself. Second will relate to the journey or the migration journey, which may result in violence, threats to self or harm, obviously unstable housing, loss of family and social networks, and any other personal losses along the way, as well as the challenges of resettling or integrating, whether it's permanent or temporary. To that extent, and the literature is vast and will vary obviously by population, we're certainly going to see high rates of mental health distress, particularly forms of distress that might be characterized along anxiety or mood, or forms of types of trauma. I'm not going to use the word PTSD, which I think can have a very specific set of diagnostic criterion. But I didn't want to, but I'm hoping that this audience will also be aware that in addition to the mental health stressors, which we are often quick to identify, we'll also see untreated chronic illnesses, decompensation of existing and have previously managed chronic mental illnesses, the altered distribution of infectious diseases, meaning that individuals may bring with them illnesses from their home country or their place of origin into new geographic zones, but may also be exposed to infectious diseases in their place of relocation that they might not have been exposed to before. I think it's important to recognize that all individuals and migrants were going to be exposed to violence, both interpersonal violence within families, between families, from hostile actors, even from along the journey, as well as where they might end up relocating. And all this is, of course, against the decreased background of decreased access to health and social services, either because access to the services may be linked to legal status, nationality, or simply not being able to access infrastructure that is already taxed or overloaded. And we saw this during COVID. Unfortunately, I think we've learned some grim lessons from how countries and social services and health infrastructures were unable to deal with a singular pandemic event. What we have seen over the last 2 years is that migrants, refugees, or internally displaced persons very often end up living in crowded urban environments where their health risks are greater, and where they may end up both living and working because their conditions are beyond their ability to control. The most basic elements of public health management that were necessary during COVID, which included physical distancing, masking, hand washing, were absolutely unavailable to large individuals of people who were displaced, and not merely because they lacked practical supplies, but also because being able to access or wanting to access new health resources or social services resources was a source of great anxiety, as people worried that any contact with official or government agencies would expose them to detention or deportation or abuse in any form. I would also note that in many countries around the world, increased in-person health access services were replaced by digital or virtual or telehealth services. But again, these are not always accessible to individuals who are displaced in a hurry, displaced in a move, or may end up in crowded environments where they have limited access to Wi-Fi and digital infrastructures. There's always discussion about what new protections and new laws and new interventions are needed. But I would place the importance of bolstering already existing health and social protections. There is copious international human rights law, which affirms the right to everyone to health. Sustainable development goals in a number of arenas emphasize the importance of states providing universal health coverage to individuals within their borders, regardless of their legal status, including, of course, vaccination access. We already have internal UN guiding principles on IDPs, which have been incorporated into things like the Kampala Convention. In other words, as we move into negotiations, I would ask our audience to think less about novel legal protections, health and social protections, rather than bolstering existing agreements and understandings and norms that we have in place. I think my take-home point for this audience is that we often treat migrations, particularly climate migrations or crisis migrations, as if they were unexpected, as if that we could not plan for them. And yet, while there is much that we could learn about anticipating migrant flows and climate migrant flows, we have copious data that already indicates to us where these flows are already occurring, where areas of climate displacement are likely to happen. And so I would encourage us to think about legal solutions that are probably, as I said earlier, regional solutions rather than rigid international ones, moving away from a single unified concept of climate migrant, and rather thinking about ones that are more specific to particular networks and to regional exposures. Thinking about a fluid legal statuses, so examples might be temporary protection status for individuals, already looking to existing agreements, perhaps around, for example, free movement agreements, thinking about labor mobility schemes, adapting current tools such as guidelines for protection in disaster contexts and adapting them for climate disasters, and thinking about creating lawful migrant flows and pathways rather than forcing individuals into illegal and often treacherous and lethal pathways of escape and entry. There's much to be said about how current international migration law and current border controls try to create distinctions, frankly, between lawful and unlawful, worthy and unworthy migrants. And perhaps the next step to thinking about climate migrants is thinking rather about flows of people and less about categories of worthiness and illegality than recognizing that these flows are inevitable, that they will ebb and flow according to conditions, and that by anticipating them and preparing for them, we will have fewer crises at our borders and fewer crises in our cities and peri-urban areas as well. So thank you so much. I will pause there, and I hope that is a setup for Anna to discuss infrastructure. Oh, let me make Tim the host.
And I think that Anna is muted right now.
Yes, sorry, I just muted. Yeah, and I'm sharing my screen. I hope everybody can see it now.
Yes, definitely visible.
Okay.
If you want to expand. Good.
Okay, great. And you're seeing it as a expanded?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much, Maya, for this invitation to share. So I'm going to be sort of taking a slightly different tack, but I hope it's seen as very interrelated with all of these discussions so far. We're familiar with this kind of map, various versions of this map, looking at the relative sort of preparedness or risk index, let's say, of various countries, various cities, conditions. Thank you. And one of the main things from our standpoint as urban designers and architects that we often see missing is a more in-depth discussion of how we would characterize existing infrastructure as relatively either an asset or a liability. And in many cases, it can be both, depending on the context and the condition. But I think a kind of assumption behind many of these sort of risk preparedness maps about the degree to which we might be able to adapt existing infrastructure, and conversely, the degree of brittleness of a lot of our so-called developed contexts. So on the map, we're seeing a city that would be firmly within the green. This is Lower Manhattan, characterized as prepared, I guess, according to certain maps. I think we saw already as a harbinger of things to come. Here we're looking at the tip of Manhattan that shares a condition with 800 million other people around the globe of being within 10 feet of sea level rise. And we saw during Hurricane Sandy what happened when just within a few days of this neighborhood here losing power, we started to see human feces pile up in certain housing projects where people did not have access to either running water, toilets, or vertical transport. We saw a lot of conditions of extreme brittleness from a context that would be considered highly developed, and an inability, in a sense, to quickly adapt or respond to what is, in essence, a kind of bioclimatic, unpredictable condition. And so within the way that we've developed our so-called developed infrastructures, they require obviously huge inputs of concentrated forms of energy. And we have also considered the so-called ecosystem services from natural capital to be inputs from which ultimately we develop our contexts, our different types of infrastructures that typically are, and in the case of the built environment process on the left here, are stressors to our natural context, to our regional, really the work of the region, the work of the geobiosphere in terms of regions, and then in globally. And of course, there's a lot of proposals out there to adapt existing cities and green them, and we can do many, many things by turning that throughput, those throughput arrows of sort of extracting natural resources into a kind of mutually beneficial feedback loop whereby we potentially convert cities into net producers of biodiversity. Certain plans and sort of designs for also including sort of being able to change regional land use patterns also through the large scale adoption of urban agriculture and other methods to lower urban heat island effects, stressors, and energy consumption, potentially purify air and water, all sorts of stressors that lead to migration and lead to the fleeing of conditions. But if we go back to that condition, if we imagine this is a future Manhattan, we might be reducing that 11,000 megawatts per day that the island of Manhattan requires currently to run all of its infrastructure, but we would only be reducing it probably by not more than 1/3 with all of the existing ways that we know how to kind of convert our mechanical and electrical and static systems into biomechanical hybrids like we just showed. Also, we've spent thousands of millennia actually developing infrastructure, urban and environmental infrastructure to keep living systems out in order to fool ourselves into thinking that we can predict their behaviors and that we can design for so-called stasis and predictability. And that's a big part of obviously the liabilities and the codes that are governing our systems for built environment process and urban processes. But if we are to actually think about bringing in living systems on a large scale that we just showed, this is really a massive paradigm shift that requires many, many more people and many more expertise in sort of looking at the relationship between the behavior of biological systems, built environment, and ecosystems. So we have all of the, sort of epic social contributors to and integrators to this process as well. And I would say this is a partial map of who would need to even be involved within the delivery of one mid-size building within the kind of context that I just showed you of a kind of greening of large scale so-called developed cities. And then if we just look at the issue of trying to supply, let's say, there's a major theme probably at COP and throughout the world of this race towards so-called net zero or even on-site net zero, as we're seeing here within that context of New York City that I just showed. This is in Staten Island. It's a net zero energy school. But we can see clearly that this, in order to render a climate within a climate like New York, which happens to be quite a severe climate, just a school needs a football field of PV panels within the existing technological context or technosphere in terms of how we would service or match our existing infrastructures. So that's just a sort of a contextual build up to discuss at what scale and in what way might we actually explore adaptability. We've spent many decades trying to explore adaptability of the context that I just showed you, this fully developed, widely developed context. And at one point, the UN asked us, could we actually, just as like a test scenario, as a kind of public demonstration project, look at the relationship between a migrant house, minimal conditions for, let's say, a kind of disaster relief or emergency housing for migrants of different conditions. And what would happen if they could not have access to existing infrastructure at all? They had to provide for all of their needs with an on-site condition. And we were very excited by this prompt, this research prompt that has led really to a kind of wholesale recontextualizing of our alliances and our network to really start from the smallest scales outward, looking at literally what do one or two, or in the case of the ELM, Ecological Living Module, 4 human beings need for sustenance, and how do they coexist with their environment? Now, I just want to say, within a legal context, we are certainly not proposing this as a solution. We are not saying that the state or should be alleviated of the responsibility to supply infrastructure for citizens in any way. This is merely a research open architecture framework to start to see if we need how would we basically recalibrate infrastructural modules at the very smallest scale in order to coexist with so-called bioclimatic or natural energy flows. I just showed it at the larger institutional or urban context that is very, very difficult to adapt or change. But if we are talking about the unit of a family, we might have a very different condition that is possible. So in this case, what we're measuring, and I would say this is only for New York climate, and we did it on the plaza, the UN headquarters plaza. We would do something completely different, even a few miles down from New York, and certainly in any type of existing context. Currently, we're partnering with long-term collaborators from Guatemala in developing some open architecture testing units for Lake Atitlan in the central area of Guatemala. And so it would be a completely different condition, because if we're interfacing with climate, we have completely different resources. And this brings up the issue also of who owns what and where do the resources come from. In this case, we're literally looking only at the envelope around this family of 4. What resources do they have access to? We can see that even in New York City, which is not the best direct solar climate, we are energy positive for what this family needs. And these are open, technology agnostic. There's could be many different technologies that we would test within this. In the case of water, we are also water positive in terms of the amount of rainwater we can collect, the amount of water we can collect from the ambient and deliver for potable. And then through plant-based processes, how are we then purifying and air and water? And how are we growing food? In the context of New York, very severe climate, we really only got to 2/3 or 65% of nutrition dense fruit and vegetable servings. But when we look at that in the context of FDA requirements, our requirements in the United States we're talking many, many thousands more servings of high density nutrition than most New York dwellers receive, the majority of people within New York. So this was, I'm just going to exit for a quick discussion of this. So this was, it looks like a quick sketch study, but it really is about bringing together at the intersection hundreds of years really of research in renewable and energies into biomechanical hybrids that can potentially look at a new way to create a relationship between, at the smallest scale, the ergonomic scale, a room or a human being, and what they have access to. It brings up so many questions, of course, of access and rights at the smallest scale, to solar, to air quality, to water quality, to the potential to grow food. And we're not proposing this necessarily as a one-size-fits-all solution. Sometimes when people see these kinds of demonstration projects, they misunderstand that this is meant to be a kind of solution. Really, it's meant to be a public discussion to understand things in a really different way in terms of metrics. And we feel that, in a sense, the domicile gets to the very heart of it. It's easy to talk about climate migrants as being outside of oneself. I realized preparing this talk that my family was technically a conflict migrant from Lower Manhattan in September 2001, and then we had to move again during Hurricane Sandy. So the sort of context within which we look at that, I think, really also needs to be questions in terms of the issue of the boundary conditions around individuals and families relative to emerging resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I am going to actually take a second here to make one of our people in the room the host, and we'll segue to Tommaso.
Yeah, thank you. Just waiting for the slides to be projected. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation again. And I think I will now address one of the questions that was included in the abstract of our panel today, and specifically on how can laws and policies on human rights and social protection be reformed to ensure more effective governance at the domestic level. So I will shift the focus a bit more specifically on displacement as a specific type of human mobility, and going to the first slide, so the next one. I will address displacement also as a specific climate-related disaster risks. It was also mentioned, and as most of you know, disaster displacement arises when people are compelled to abandon their homes, and in the aftermath of a disaster or in anticipation of an impending one. And for this reason, displacement is considered as one of the most common and immediate impacts of any disaster. And in the specific context of disasters and climate change, it has been described as one of the greatest humanitarian challenges of the 21st century. It is interesting to know how disaster displacement is also a global trend, which increasingly frames actions on climate change, including the humanitarian action. So according to the latest global report of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, at the end of 2020, a record number of people worldwide, around 55 million in total, were living in internal displacement. And it's interesting also to explore these data and understand how internal displacement due to disasters is particularly global in nature. In 2020, it affected nearly twice as many countries as those experiencing internal displacement due to conflict and violence. So we are talking about 104 for disaster-related displacement compared to 59 experiencing displacement due to conflict and violence, number of countries. Nor was disaster displacement largely confined to fragile or failing states such as Afghanistan, Syria, and South Sudan, but included in the top 10 countries in terms of the absolute number of people displaced by disasters in 2020 were both China with 5.1 million people displaced and the United States of America with 1.7 million people displaced. So in the next slide, thank you, we can see how disasters are also overwhelmingly the context in which new displacements occur. Approximately 40 million people were recorded as newly displaced in 2020, which was the highest figure for a decade. And of these, disasters triggered over 3 times as much displacement, some of 30 million people, than conflict and violence, which led to 9.8 million people being displaced. And of those displaced by disasters, climate-related weather hazards such as storms, cyclones, floods, drought, and extreme heat were response for almost all new displacement in 2020, some of 30 million, so the 98%. Can you skip to the next slide, please? Thank you. No, the previous one. Thank you very much. So these numbers, these are the numbers I was referring to. You can see, so the number of people displaced in 2020 and the proportion between people displaced because of conflict and violence on the left side of the screen in orange, and the bigger proportion of people displaced due to disasters, of which climate-related disasters influenced for 98% of the total. So the climate and weather-related hazards accounted by far most new displacement in 2020. This is quite clear. And year on year for the past decade, displacement in the context of disasters has far exceeded that of conflict and violence. Next slide, please. So another interesting aspect to note here is that related to the timing of displacement. While many people are able to return home in the days or weeks after disaster and begin to rebuild their lives, it is a mistake to assume that all displacement due to disasters is of a short-term nature. Disaster-related displacement can last many months or even years, particularly in cases where it is not possible for displaced people to return home, for example, in cases of riverbank erosion caused by swollen rivers due to increased precipitation. So they must be relocated elsewhere in these cases. And this is there is a particularly significant data gap as regards the length of displacement. This is because little data on displacement is collected after the emergency phase, and evacuees are not tracked to monitor if or when they are able to return most of the time. Furthermore, where the climate-related hazards is of a slow onset nature, and this goes back to what Kate was explaining, such as desertification or sea level rise, there is an even larger gap in the data, and this is due to the longer time frames over which the hazards manifest. And this means that it can be hard to isolate displacement as a relevant form of mobility as distinct from a more voluntary adaptive migration until the localized impact of a climate-related hazards reaches a critical level of intensity. So in the next slide, thank you. We can start. I can start illustrating how and where is the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement positioned in all of these. And the trend I just described mean that prevention of displacement and responding to the needs of the displaced in the context of disasters and climate change is and will remain at the forefront of humanitarian endeavor, and therefore of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement's scope of action. The range of climate-related hazards which impact the lives and livelihoods of people implies an increasing range of activities being undertaken by the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, 192 in all, scattered across every region in the world. And in these efforts, they are supported by the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, And it's interesting to note how the movement's strategic approach on internal displacement is that displacement should be avoided and that affected communities should be supported to remain where they are, of course, as long as their safety, physical integrity and dignity are not jeopardized, and if this is in accordance with their wishes. But when displacement does occur, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement recognizes that it cannot meet all the needs arising in its wake, but will endeavor to meet those needs, including through partnership in those contexts where national authorities find their resources overstretched or weakened. And it's important to note that national authorities have the primary duty of care in these cases. In the next slide, we can see how in all of these, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement gradually explored how laws, policies, and regulations provide a starting point to address the complex issues raised by climate-related displacement. This is because having a clear legal and regulatory framework that coheres with human rights obligation is vitally important for, first of all, for allocating roles and responsibilities throughout the disaster risk management phases, and to provide a legally sanctioned foundation from which to establish practical measures and meet the assistance and protection needs of those displaced, namely by protecting communities against displacement, preparing for unavoidable displacement, responding to displacement, and supporting the realization of durable solutions. It is important to understand how legal preparedness is particularly relevant for planned relocation when it's aimed at reducing the risk of future displacement due to climate-related hazards. And in this case, we're talking about durable solution, as I said, to existing displacement by ensuring that planned relocation is by consent and undertaken as a last resort in light of the policy the movement is adopting that I just mentioned. Finally, it's very important from a community-centered perspective, which is the Red Cross, Red Crescent one, that preparedness and response activities are grounded in law, also to promote transparency and accountability. So requiring the active involvement of people at risk for displacement or already displaced by disasters in the assessment of risks, planning, and decision making. The very last point is in the next slide, thank you, and we more specifically on what IFRC disaster law is doing, and this special program illustrates the work that the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is doing to enhance legal preparedness. IFRC disaster law works in three main areas, as you can see. So first of all, providing technical assistance and advice to governments that are reviewing their domestic disaster laws and policies, conducting capacity building, and publishing research and guidance on all aspects of disasters. As an example, in 2019, IFRC disaster law developed a checklist on law and disaster preparedness and response, which offers a guidance on key consideration in the assessment of laws to ensure they provide the best support for disaster preparedness and response, including an assessment of whether existing law, domestic law, adequately and appropriately regulates all types of disaster-related human mobility. So it's linked to the topic we are addressing today. In the next slide, there is a very brief explanation on how this dynamic goes from the global to the local. In this case, I'm just referring to how legal preparedness is explicitly anchored in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and is a critical element towards the achievement of priority 2. At the same time, of course, we all know how Paris Agreement requires parties, states, to develop and enhance national adaptation plans, and this has been recognized as an important vehicle tool for integrated human mobility concern, such as preventing displacement into laws and policies aimed at strengthening adaptation and planning. However, despite this legal global framework, there is an existing gap in legal preparedness that was highlighted by 2018 summary report of the Task Force on Displacement, which one of the 5 expert groups established under the WIM, and on which the IFRC is a member. And this mapping of human mobility and climate change in relevant national policies and institutional frameworks evidence this gap. Just to give you a final example, going to the local, even if legal reform can take time, a recent disaster law case study evidence how the case of Fiji shows how the process of reviewing existing laws to see how they can be improved can be in itself, can have a positive operational impact long before laws are effectively enacted by, for instance, reminding and educating officials as to their roles and responsibility on how to improve disaster risk governance, including how to undertake consultation with all stakeholders, at-risk communities, non-governmental actors. And this process, as I said, in Fiji, forced the national NDMO, National Disaster Management Office, which is a governmental agency, to adopting a more integrated approach, also addressing displacement and planned relocation as part
Tommaso, thank you so much. Just so that we can have about 5 minutes of questions, because we are running a little bit over on time. So if we might just wrap up in one sentence, and then we need to get some questions from the audience.
Yeah, it's almost, I am almost finished. It's just an example of Fiji, which is particularly relevant. And in the next slide, I will just leave you with a collection of some of the key messages that IFRC presented at COP26 with a focus on how to enhance legal preparedness as a critical means to manage climate and disaster risks. And you see that here are included most of the points I already touched upon during my presentation. So maybe I will leave it now, and I look forward for some Q&A on this aspect as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. Thank you to all of our contributors and our participants in the panel. It's been truly insightful for all of us, I think, as listeners as well as speakers. So we do have a limited time for questions, but we'll be happy to start with anyone from the audience, live audience, and if not, we'll get to anyone who has posted questions in the chat or the Q&A. But if there's anyone from the audience who would like to ask anything, please don't be shy. I know that questions are all that stand between you and lunch, so I do appreciate that. But at the same time, if there's anyone in the audience, feel free. If not, perhaps we could have a question from our online audience.
Yes, there was one question from Natalie Flores. So Dr. Pagu briefly answered it in the chat, but maybe she wants to expand on it for the audience. The question was, you mentioned the need to focus on already existing provisions and agreements, including the use of regional mechanisms. Can you mention some of the regional options you see particularly relevant to address some of the challenges to climate migration and potentially some ones that are occurring in Southeast Asia?
Hi, Alex. So I will just repeat the question very briefly for the online audience who probably didn't hear that question being spoken out loud, but it had to do with regional tools that particularly might be relevant in Southeast Asia. And it's true that in my talk, I had referenced free movement associations and flexible labor agreements. That I was particularly thinking about African examples. I'm not able to identify any Asian examples, which had been the question, although I did note in my answer the Sydney Declaration on Principles on the Protection of Persons Displaced in the Context of Sea Level Rise. So I identified the Sydney Declaration an example of a regional specific tool or response. So I'd be very curious to know if other people on our online audience can identify Asian examples as well. I was thinking that there was probably this panel has tried to link the empirical work, empirical research with practical interventions. And I thought that was particularly highlighted in Anna's talk. So I actually had a question for Anna. And I recognize that do you have any broad comments you could make around the challenges of creating sustainable infrastructure in the context of local laws and regional laws and policies? Because while we are speaking at an international level, international frameworks, the interventions are going to happen at a very local, on the ground level. And I don't know if you want to speak broadly about any challenges that you have experienced as takeaway lessons from our audience, who will have to go back home and think about how to operationalize things in their own local contexts.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's so many that it's hard to know where to start. I think as a broad overview, I think the way that Kate started talking about this as a multi-scalar problem is really, really important. From the standpoint of just, physical infrastructure, that multi-scalar problem becomes really acute when we start thinking about who owns what, if we're having to rely on bioclimatic resources, or we're having to respond to them in a different way than what we do sort of typically within, let's say, property and building codes and other conditions. So within a migrant context, for instance, typically in places where we've worked, we're not able to in any way touch the ground or go into the infrastructure or attach to the infrastructure, as an example. So that would just be, the kind of extreme condition of sort of non-integration, which does resemble in a way a lot of the informal settlements also sort of globally, just sort of basic rural to urban migration into peri-urban conditions where there isn't connection to any type of sanctioned infrastructure. So I do think that that sort of tension between what is sanctioned, what is then designated or controlled, and then what is not controlled or sanctioned by the state is really the nexus at which all of these multi-scalar problems start to, in a sense, come up. And I think that really the big thing that we're seeing now emerging throughout any type of context is the emergence of reconsidering rights and access to bioclimatic resources. Because as we get better and better at learning how to convert them very inexpensively and very locally, then that obviously will become a huge issue that is currently, I think, in a sense, way understudied from our standpoint, from the standpoint of looking at that relationship between the formal and informal, let's say, settlement.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I have been advised that we are actually out of time. We have 1 minute left to close, which is to say thank you all for joining. I know that this is a topic that will continue to be discussed. It will continue to be discussed throughout the COP this year, into future COPs as well. We hope we can continue this discussion. And this is only the beginning of a launching off point for much more future growth and development. But we thank all of our online panelists. We hope that next time we can all be together in person, hopefully next year. We thank our audience members, both online as well as in the room, and especially those of you in the room. It is, to echo this morning's sentiments from Lord Mance, it is wonderful to see you all in person and to not just be speaking to screens, but to speaking to humans with interactive faces, and to get a sense of what we're doing here today and the importance of it. So thank you all. And I believe now we are meant to adjourn to lunch, and guides will show you the way. So thank you all. Thank you to our online panelists. It is a pleasure. You all be well. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.